Hey friends, tonight we're cracking open a tale that's as ancient as the stars. But trust me, it hits with the unexpected punch of a midnight snack you didn't plan on, but somehow can't stop eating. Picture this. You're perched on an old chair that groans every time you shift. A lazy ceiling fan stirs the air above, and somewhere outside, an owl's call cuts through the stillness like a whisper from another world. This isn't your high school history class. This is God's throwing shade over fruit, forgotten betrayals that never made it into the textbooks, and moments so wild they make reality TV look like child's play. And yeah, you might want to brace yourself, because what's coming isn't just history, it's a ride through the strange, the sacred, and the straight-up surreal. So before we jump in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Only if you vibe with these late-night dives into the weird and wonderful. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you all are tuning in from. It's like we're sharing one long cosmic campfire. Alright, lights down, volume up, and let that hum of the fan settle into your bones. Let's step into tonight's story together. You trudge back in time now, far, far back, before medieval cathedrals and knightly codes, before kings and queens lace themselves into embroidered myths. You land in the hot, shimmering dust of ancient Eden, where a single bite still echoes across centuries. Eve, apple in hand, eyes wide, becomes not just a character in a story, but a symbol that shadowed women for generations. In that single act of curiosity or defiance, historians still argue which. Eve wasn't just cast from paradise. She was drafted, unwillingly, into a spiritual tug-of-war, where her body, her mind, her desire became an open battlefield. You watch as theologians, centuries later, lean into this tale like it's a divine roadmap. St. Augustine, that famously conflicted philosopher-turned-bishop, trembles with guilt over his own youthful escapades and decides, naturally, that sexual desire must be a result of original sin. Thanks, Eve. One theologian's bad breakup becomes doctrine for millions. Desire, you're told, is a slippery slope, and worse if it's feminine. It's not just risky, it's ruinous. Eve's appetite becomes the prototype of all future sins. Women, in the minds of these early thinkers, are born with an appetite that must be watched, corrected, and if necessary, extinguished. And this idea? It spreads like candle wax on warm stone, soft, sticky, impossible to fully scrape away. You feel it creeping across sermons, scrawled in the margins of Bibles, whispered in cloisters. Tertullian, another church father, writes that women are the devil's gateway, blaming them for the fall of man with all the subtlety of a slam poet in a bad mood. As you sit with that thought, it occurs to you, none of this was accidental. These weren't just spiritual opinions. These were control strategies wrapped in incense smoke. The idea that women were dangerous because of their desires made it easier to restrict them. Socially, sexually, politically. You watch, slowly, as culture builds a fortress against female agency, brick by theological brick. Somewhere a bell tolls, time for prayers. You slip into a medieval chapel, candlelight dancing across stone walls, and notice, women are always being depicted one of two ways, pure virgin or sly temptress, no in-between. And that binary, it's sharp enough to draw blood. You shuffle past a carved wooden panel, Eve again, this time naked and flanked by serpents. Her eyes aren't afraid, they're curious. That's the part that rattled everyone the most, her curiosity. Curiosity leads to action. Action leads to choice, and choice, well, that could bring down paradise. Even today, scholars scratch their heads over just how deeply this narrative embedded itself into everything from politics to puberty. Did people really think women's desire was inherently evil? Or was that a convenient story passed down like a family heirloom no one wanted but everyone kept? Still, you sit with the stories. Eve wasn't alone after all. Lilith, the lesser-known first woman of Jewish folklore, was exiled not for eating fruit, but for refusing to submit to Adam's authority. Some versions say she demanded sexual equality, that she wanted to be on top, literally and symbolically. So they cast her out and called her a demon, and just like that you see it again. Desire, dangerous. Independence, evil. The message is loud enough to echo through stone walls. It hums in cloisters, it trickles into the bloodstream of every rule and restriction that follows. You trail your fingers along a tapestry, its threads worn but still shimmering, with the story of Susanna and the elders. A woman falsely accused of lust. 2 men try to assault her, then lie about it when she resists. But somehow the question becomes about her modesty, her virtue, her potential guilt. Not theirs, never theirs. It's not just myth or metaphor. It becomes embedded in law, in daily life, in medicine and marriage. You sigh, hearing the creak of another pew settle behind you. The story of female desire is retold again and again, but only by those who feared it. It wasn't just church fathers and monks. Poets joined in, painting women's longing as a kind of beautiful doom. Even love stories were rigged. Woman meets man, woman wants man. Woman either dies, repents, or becomes a nun. You never hear what happens if she just lives. A candle sputters beside you. Maybe you notice how quiet it is here. How even history, sometimes, wants to hush this part of the tale. But it's there, buried under layers of script and suspicion. You lie back again, the air thick with incense and whispered doctrine, and let your mind drift to the next page. Because the story isn't over. It's only just exhaled its first breath. The seed has been planted. Women's desire is linked to the fall, to demons, to shame, and now the real shadow begins to stretch. You blink slowly and the candle smoke clears. The room fades. Now you're outside again, beneath a sky studded with stars and cold with judgment. You've stepped into the minds of the early medieval church fathers, where the real battleground isn't a field or fortress, it's the body, and more specifically, the female body. Here, desire is not a private feeling or a fleeting impulse. It's a cosmic doorway, a crack in the soul where the devil might slip in. They call it concupiscence, a fancy Latin word that rolls off the tongue like a curse and simply means desire gone wrong. And in the Middle Ages, concupiscence wasn't just unfortunate. It was a fire that burned down virtue, a signal flare for demons, especially if it was coming from a woman. You shift your weight on the metaphorical stone bench and glance around the room of medieval minds. Most of them are male. Most of them have spent their adult lives in monasteries. And most of them are very, very nervous about women. You don't blame them entirely. They were taught that everything on earth was a shadow of a spiritual truth. If something felt good, it probably led to damnation. Take Saint Jerome, that linguistic genius who translated the Bible into Latin. He was constantly writing about the dangers of women. He once warned that a man should never sit next to a woman, not even his sister, because their mere proximity might trigger temptation. You think of that advice the next time you sit on a bus, or maybe don't. But Jerome wasn't alone. There was a kind of groupthink going on, an anxious echo chamber where men kept warning each other, louder and louder, about the explosive power of female desire. They told each other that women's longing wasn't just a personal issue. It was a spiritual contagion. The devil, they said, doesn't knock politely on the front door of your soul. He whispers through eyelashes. He curves his will through hips and perfume. He enters through suggestion, laughter, and the glimpse of skin not fully covered by woolen robes. You might chuckle now, imagining medieval monks huddled in cold stone cells, terrified of their own thoughts. But to them this was serious, a matter of eternal life and death. And in this worldview, women's desire wasn't neutral. It was demonic by default. Even their nightmares agreed. You find yourself standing in the thick parchment folds of medieval dream literature. Over and over, monks and mystics reported erotic dreams, always blaming demons disguised as women. These weren't dreams, they were assaults, they claimed. The devil had taken the shape of a temptress, maybe even a specific woman from the village. Suddenly, your average lust becomes a cosmic ambush. This belief turned women into spiritual hazards. And as you're realizing, when something is feared as a hazard, it gets regulated, sometimes harshly. This is the age where modesty becomes armor, and anything else is an invitation. If your hem is too high, or your neckline too low, or even if your eyes linger too long, you're no longer a woman. You're a spiritual landmine. Historians still argue whether this fear of desire was genuinely believed or partially constructed to reinforce male authority. But for the women living in it, the result was the same. Whether real panic or political posturing, the outcome was a constant suspicion. You're watching a world where women's agency is tied up in two competing fears. Either she wants too much, or she doesn't want the right things. If she desires a man, she's dangerous. If she desires freedom, she's deluded. If she desires God too much, well, now she's suspiciously holy. That's another problem entirely. We'll get there. But for now, back to these church fathers and their terror of temptation. You peek over Augustine's shoulder again. Remember him? The ex-playboy turned guilt machine? He once said that the body of the woman is the weapon of the devil, and that's not even his spiciest quote. The medieval church inherited Augustine's shame like a family secret, passed down in dark libraries. It made its way into preaching, penance, policy. Bishops weren't just religious leaders, they were moral architects, building a world where desire had gates and guards and very few keys, especially for women. One of the oddest things? This obsession with suppressing desire seemed to lead straight to, well, obsession. Monks and clergy wrote endlessly about temptation, sometimes in lurid detail. You read their journals, and it sounds less like repression and more like a roundabout way of fantasizing. It's as if the more they tried not to think about women, the more they wrote about them. You imagine a monk scribbling frantically by candlelight, pausing to flagellate himself with a thorn branch, then continuing his diary about Sister Agnes and the way she smiled last Tuesday. You kind of want to tell him to touch grass. There's even a name for one type of demonic female figure that appears in medieval sleep lore: the succubus. She visits in the night, seduces in dreams, and steals the vitality of men. But the succubus wasn't just a fantasy villain. She was a religious warning label stuck to any woman who stepped outside the script. Unmarried, too confident, too attractive. Maybe you're not just different, maybe you're possessed. But not all women were seen as sex demons. The church made space for another extreme, the Virgin Mary. She becomes the spiritual antithesis of Eve. Mary says yes to God, where Eve said yes to desire. One woman damned the world, the other gave birth to salvation. And so begins the long-standing pattern. Women are either demonic or divine, temptresses or saints. There is no middle path. No ordinary girl just trying to figure things out. You lean back and take this in, like staring at a medieval mural and noticing for the first time how tilted everything is. You wonder, how did women themselves feel about all this? Some conformed. Some became nuns and embraced the model of holy purity. Others leaned into mysticism, visions and ecstatic encounters with the divine. But more on that later. For now, most women simply had to live under a cloud of constant suspicion, where the flicker of desire could light a pyre. One strange little detail: some monasteries had rules where women couldn't eat in front of men. Eating was too sensual. Yes, you heard that right. A bite of bread could be considered indecent. That's how deep the fear ran. Even the act of nourishment was policed. And you're starting to see the pattern. When you fear something deeply enough, you'll reshape the entire world to avoid it. You'll create clothing codes, confession manuals, dream warnings, dietary rules. You'll turn desire into a theological landmine, and then blame the person who steps on it. It's a little like medieval gaslighting, really. By now, you can almost feel the paranoia crawling up the cold stone walls of this world. A kind of sacred sexism cloaked in spiritual urgency. But beneath all of it, you sense the core anxiety. Control. Who gets to desire? Who gets to act on it? Who gets to define what's sin and what's natural? You pull the blanket closer now, because the night is thick with tension. You've only just started scratching at the surface of this beautifully twisted logic, where women's desire isn't just feared, it's blamed. And the next time someone in the village wakes from a dream, sweaty and rattled, the priest won't ask what he ate. He'll ask who he saw, and he'll wonder, was it a woman or something darker? You're still lying in the flickering candlelight of that restless medieval world, and now the prayers have quieted, the monks are asleep, or trying to be. But the silence, it isn't peaceful, it's charged. Because here's the thing about suppressing desire, it doesn't go away. It just gets louder in the dark. And no one knew that better than the very men who were supposed to be the guardians of chastity. Monks, priests, saints in training, who spent their nights in cold stone cells, praying away the images they could never quite unsee. You tiptoe into one of those cells now. There's a figure hunched in the corner, muttering Latin prayers under his breath, like they're a magic spell. He hasn't eaten much. He's been fasting to subdue his flesh. But his eyes dart around the room like he's trying to escape something invisible. And he is. Desire, after all, doesn't knock. It barges in, and no number of Ave Marias will make it stop if your brain is wired for longing. You're in the mind of a monk now. He's read the warnings. He knows Eve's mistake. He's committed to holiness. But last night, in his sleep, he saw a woman. No one he knows, just a figure wrapped in beauty and danger. And when he woke up, the shame clung to him like sweat. What does he do? He blames the devil, of course. That's the safest move. Maybe he writes it down in his spiritual journal, calling it an assault from a demonic spirit. The idea of admitting the desire came from him, unthinkable. Historians still argue whether these monks truly believed women were literal agents of Satan, or if this was just a convenient narrative to avoid personal accountability. Either way, the outcome is the same. Female sexuality becomes the scapegoat for male guilt. You're hearing it now, whispered between chapel walls. It's not me, it's her. It's always her. But not all monks kept quiet. Some spilled their struggle onto parchment with astonishing honesty. One 12th century writer, Peter of Celle, described the spiritual torment caused by seeing women at church, particularly their hair. Yep, hair. That little detail becomes a whole crisis, because if just seeing a woman makes you sin, then the world must be full of moral traps, and the safest route? Avoid women entirely. And so begins a slow, centuries-long habit, making women invisible to make men pure. Churches eventually started creating women-only spaces, blocking them from singing in choirs or even standing near the altar. Because maybe, if you remove the woman, you remove the temptation. Out of sight, out of sin. Except that never really works, does it? You walk with a group of pilgrims now, shuffling across dusty roads in itchy wool robes. Each step a prayer, each mile a kind of penance. They visit holy relics, weep before statues, whisper prayers into the bones of saints. But even here, on a sacred journey, temptation travels with them. You overhear hushed confessions, pilgrims admitting to impure thoughts, always rooted in something a woman did or wore or accidentally suggested. Never mind the long days, the hunger, the human longing for comfort. It's easier to say, "She tempted me." You begin to sense just how circular all of this is. Men desire, men feel guilt, men blame women. Women are punished, men are protected, cycle repeats. And in monasteries, the cycle plays out on a loop. Some monks took it further, choosing self-flagellation, whipping their own backs, to drive the sin from their flesh. Not because they committed a crime, just because they thought about a woman. There's a joke in here somewhere. Probably about how the guys so afraid of lust ended up shirtless, alone, and whipping themselves. But let's keep it PG. The real twist? While desire was demonized, it also became strangely glamorous in saint stories. Some of the most famous male saints wrote about their battles with lust in almost dramatic fashion, like spiritual soap operas. Take Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism. One night, he was overwhelmed by desire for a woman he'd once seen. So what did he do? He stripped off his clothes and threw himself into a thorn bush. You wince just imagining it. And yet, this story became inspirational, a model of triumph over the body, because in medieval logic, suffering, holiness, another monk dreamed he was being seduced by a demon woman. He resisted by biting off his own tongue. Again, yikes. But to medieval ears, this was a success story. It's almost poetic in its absurdity. Men judged women's desire as evil, then obsessed so much over resisting it that they built entire identities around the struggle. Meanwhile, real women who were just living their lives got caught in the crossfire. You feel for them now? For the laundress who lowers her eyes when passing monks on the road, worried a look might be misread. For the young girl in church whose uncovered hair becomes a public scandal. For the midwife accused of sorcery because she knows too much about the body. And for the women who dared to love, or want, or enjoy anything at all, they were either suspicious or scandalous. Because according to the monks, holy women didn't want, they endured. And yet, you find little moments of rebellion, quiet ones, a marginal drawing in a manuscript where a nun sticks out her tongue, a love poem tucked into a religious text, a saint's vision that looks suspiciously like an orgasm. You start to realize the suppression never quite works. Desire always leaks through the cracks. The more it's forbidden, the more it flickers, bright and stubborn. But for the men in charge, the fear remains. If women are allowed to want, what happens to order, to hierarchy, to control? So they keep writing, more rules, more sermons, more cautionary tales. Because if you can't remove the desire, at least you can demonize it. You walk past a stained glass window now. It shows a woman, clothed in red, clutching an apple. Her face is calm, almost serene. The artist probably didn't mean to, but they've painted her not as a monster, but as something far more dangerous, a woman who knows. And the men in these stories, they can't look away. You drift now through the thick herbal smoke of a medieval infirmary, past shelves stacked with amber bottles, dried roots, and pungent poultices. Everything smells of vinegar and mystery. A worn-out healer leans over a scroll, furrowed brow lit by a low flame. She's reading, no, deciphering, what passed for medicine in a world where science and superstition held hands like anxious lovers. Here the body is a map of humors, fluids, balances and imbalances. And women? Their bodies are wild cards in this system, mysterious, unpredictable, a kind of walking riddle, and most medieval doctors were very sure they had the answer. Unfortunately, the answer was usually wrong. You sit in on a lecture in a medieval university, a rare privilege. The professor wears robes like a wizard and speaks in Latin like it's a spell. He talks about the womb, not as an organ, as a creature. According to some ancient theories still popular at the time, the womb could move around inside a woman's body, like a roaming animal, a literal wandering womb. You blink. He continues. If a woman became too emotional or too lustful, her womb might float upward, pressing on her lungs, causing choking, fainting, or worse. They called this hysteria, a medical condition caused by a disobedient uterus. You start to realize that medieval medicine didn't just misunderstand women's bodies, it feared them. The womb was mysterious, unpredictable, and maybe even dangerous. Desire? That wasn't a natural part of being human. It was a symptom, a medical problem, something to be treated. So how did you treat it? With herbs, with prayer, with bloodletting, with, on rare and awkward occasions, a midwife's manual intervention. Let's just say the cure sometimes made the church more uncomfortable than the condition. But hysteria wasn't just about the body. It was a convenient explanation for anything that didn't fit. A woman has too many opinions? Hysteria. A woman resists marriage? Hysteria. A woman cries during a sermon, sees visions, or simply expresses longing? You guessed it. Historians still argue whether the wandering womb was taken literally by physicians or used as a metaphor for untamed female emotion. But either way, it shaped how women were treated, not just in clinics, but in daily life. Their feelings became medical events. Their desire, a sign of illness. You lean into this idea a bit more now, because it explains so much. If desire is a sickness, then doctors can control it. And by doctors, we mostly mean male clerics with medical side gigs. They weren't trained scientists. They were philosophers in aprons, quoting Aristotle between applying leeches. Speaking of Aristotle, he had thoughts, many thoughts, about women. According to him, women were basically incomplete men. Their bodies were colder, wetter, more passive, which, in his logic, meant they were naturally more prone to irrationality and, yes, overactive desire. You start to see how ancient Greek philosophy mixed with early Christian theology like a strange stew, each spoonful more bizarre than the last. Desire in men, powerful, ambitious, a force to be tamed maybe, but also to be respected. Desire in women, wild, weak, a danger to themselves and to others. You picture a young woman visiting the town healer. She's feeling strange, restless. She wants things she can't name. The healer listens, nods, then prescribes a combination of herbs, fasting, and confession. Not because anything's wrong with her soul, but because clearly her body has turned against her. You shiver a little, imagining how lonely that must have felt. To not understand your own body and to have everyone around you interpret it through the lens of fear. Sometimes, women didn't even report their symptoms. Sometimes their families did. A father worried about his daughter's strange moods. A husband unsettled by his wife's affection, or lack thereof. The healer listens and nods again. Sounds like the womb. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was mainstream. Even medical textbooks like the Trotula, a widely used guide on women's health, offered recipes to cool the womb or calm a choleric temperament, both euphemisms for make her less horny. And sometimes you wonder if those recipes ever worked, or if they just gave everyone a false sense of control. Sprinkle in some rue and mugwort, and suddenly it's not her choice, it's the potions. Desire became something done to women, not something they had. And when it did surface, through touch, through dreams, through longing, it was categorized like a disease, something to treat, something to fear. This fear went beyond sex. It extended into pregnancy and childbirth too. You trail a midwife through the birthing room, the air thick with screams and rosemary. Everyone's praying, not just for the child's safety, but for the mother's soul. Why? Because childbirth was seen as punishment for Eve's original sin, painful, dangerous, and morally complicated. And if a woman died during labor, which many did, people whispered about unconfessed sins, unclean lives, or desire that hadn't been tamed. Death in childbirth wasn't just a tragedy, it was almost a warning. You pass by a church door and see a stone carving. Eve, again, cradling her belly in shame. Even reproduction, the so-called purpose of desire, becomes laced with guilt. But here's a twist in the tale. Some medieval women used this system to their advantage. Certain nuns and mystics learned how to perform piety in ways that got them respect, safety, even leadership. They weren't all silent victims. Some leaned into the idea of divine suffering, claiming that their physical pain or passionate longing was a sign of holiness. They turn their desire into devotion, their hunger for touch into hunger for God. It was a kind of holy rebranding. We'll get deeper into those stories soon. But for now, you just sit in this contradiction. The same system that punished women for their desires also allowed them, in rare cases, to become saints by sublimating that desire. You look out over the town square now, where women bustle between market stalls and stone chapels, carrying baskets and secrets. Some of them are in love, some are lonely, some feel things they can't say out loud, and most of them are just trying to make it through the day without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Because if a woman's body acts up, if she blushes, flirts, dreams, aches, it's not a mood, it's a diagnosis. And the cure? Well, that depends who's watching. You step now into a strange corridor of candlelight and whispers, where the faces on the walls aren't portraits but painted beasts. Half women, half animal, all warning. These are not saints or queens or even sinners. These are symbols, and they're everywhere. Lurking in margins, leering from church walls, staring from stained glass with eyes that seem to follow you, even now. You're in the world of the monstrous feminine. It's not enough, in this age, to say women are dangerous. That message has already been written into laws, sermons, and medical books. No, now the fear of female desire is being carved into myth, sewn into story, drawn into the margins of every holy book, like a secret footnote with fangs. Let's start with something small, say a medieval bestiary. On the surface, these were books cataloging animals and their supposed behaviors. Lions, eagles, dragons, and mermaids. Yes, mermaids. Half woman, half fish, often shown combing their hair and luring sailors to their deaths. The message is subtle as a brick, female beauty, Verdauer's trap. You lean closer to the page. That shimmering tale isn't about the sea. It's about danger. It's about desire with nowhere safe to land. These creatures, these not quite human women, embody a specific kind of fear. A fear that if a woman wants, she might consume. And the imagery gets darker from here. You stumble into a carving of a siren. Not the sleek Disney version. This one has bird claws, wild eyes, and bare breasts. She sings, yes, but her song doesn't enchant, it devours. To medieval men, female allure wasn't just seductive, it was predatory. Historians still argue whether this monstrous imagery reflected genuine fears or served as exaggerated cautionary tales. But what's clear is how often the symbols show up, again and again, stitched into banners, painted on walls, etched onto pews. You couldn't escape them, even in church. There's one creature that keeps popping up, the lamia, a woman with the lower half of a serpent. Some tales say she eats children. Others say she seduces men, drains their strength, then leaves them hollow. She's desire with teeth. And then, yes, there's the infamous vagina dentata. You heard that right. Toothed vagina. A myth that pops up in different cultures, but found a particularly grim echo in the medieval mindset. The story goes that some women had hidden teeth down there. Symbolic, yes, but also deeply telling. It's the idea that what draws you in might also destroy you. Now you pause, because this isn't just fear, it's fascination. Monks write about temptation like it's a dragon to be slain, but you start to notice something else, a flicker of curiosity, like they can't stop looking. These monstrous women, dangerous, seductive, surreal, are warnings, yes, but also obsessions. You sit at the edge of a page, watching as a scribe draws a naked woman transforming into a beast. His ink slows a little on the curves. His marginalia becomes strangely detailed. Somewhere in the distance, a confession waits. In this world, desire, especially female desire, isn't human. It's other. It's cloaked in scales, given claws or wings, draped in horror so no one has to admit they want it too. You start to understand. If you label something monstrous, you never have to wrestle with why you're drawn to it. You walk through a chapel where the pillars are carved with women vomiting snakes, biting their own breasts, giving birth to devils. These aren't just metaphors, they're statements. That the female body, ungoverned, is a threat. That to desire is to teeter on the edge of chaos. It wasn't just art either. Literature piled on. In some medieval romances, women are literally shapeshifters. Beautiful maidens who turn into dragons, or vice versa. The message? Be careful what you love. It might reveal its teeth. Even the language followed suit. The Latin word femina, woman, was linked in sermons to Fides Minor, lesser faith. A pun, but a powerful one. Even etymology turned into theology. Meanwhile, demons were often imagined in female form when they were seducing. Why? Because it fit. Because when men had impure thoughts, it was easier to say it was a demonic attack than a personal craving. Desire wasn't a struggle, it was an invasion, and so the demon woman archetype grew. You meet Asmodeus, a demon of lust, often described as taking on a woman's form to seduce monks. Or the succubus, who shows up at night, slides into dreams, and leaves the sleeper weak with shame. But again, these figures are shaped by the fear of women having control over men, over themselves, over the spiritual order. You lean back, noticing how it all connects. Medical hysteria, demonology, and art. They're different languages telling the same story. If women are allowed to want, the world falls apart. But here's the twist. The monstrous feminine also holds power. In a society where women were silenced, erased, or bound to roles they didn't choose, becoming a monster was, in a twisted way, a kind of freedom. You remember Melusine, a legendary figure from French folklore. She's part woman, part serpent, and she marries a nobleman on one condition. He must never see her on Saturdays. Of course he breaks the rule, finds her in her serpentine form. She screams, transforms, and vanishes, but she doesn't die. She becomes a ghostly presence, watching, hovering. Her image ends up on coats of arms, her tale whispered at court. She's monstrous, but unforgettable. You realize now, the monstrous feminine isn't just about fear, it's about resistance. If the only roles available are virgin or demon, some women, at least in myth, chose the wings, the fangs, the flames, because monsters aren't bound by rules, and maybe, just maybe, they don't ask permission. You wake now under a blood-orange sky, where the clouds don't drift, they churn. There's something thick in the air, like it's holding its breath. You walk into the growing tension of the late Middle Ages, and this time, it's not just whispers behind cloister doors, it's shouts, accusations, torches. You're standing at the edge of one of history's darker storms, the rise of the witch hunts, and the flame at its center, still that same old fear, female desire. You've probably heard about witches before. Black cats, bubbling cauldrons, pointy hats, cute Halloween stuff. But in the late medieval world, witches weren't a costume. They were a cosmic threat. They were women, often older, sometimes midwives, sometimes healers, who were accused of cavorting with the devil. And yes, a huge part of that accusation came down to desire. Here's where it gets especially strange. Some theologians genuinely believed that women were more prone to witchcraft because they were more sexually driven, more emotional, more carnal, a weaker vessel, and therefore easier for Satan to recruit. Logic so circular you could spin it like a coin. You sit quietly in a town square as a friar reads aloud from the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. It's a bestseller in the worst way. And it says, without even blinking, that women are more likely to become witches because they are impressionable and have slippery tongues. Real quote. You shake your head. Slippery tongues. That's the theological equivalent of blaming women for being good at talking. But here's the real kicker. The Malleus also links witchcraft directly to lust. It says that women, driven by insatiable sexual appetites, make pacts with demons in exchange for pleasure. Even in evil, female desire had to be the driving force. It's not just a sin anymore, it's a crime. You watch as the old lines between desire, power, and punishment start to dissolve. A woman who wanted too much knowledge, too much control, too much love, wasn't just frowned upon. She was hunted. And you know what's even more twisted? Sometimes the accusations had nothing to do with spells or potions. A neighbor gets jealous. A man has a dream he can't explain. A child gets sick. The town looks around and points to the woman who lived alone, or who never married, or who maybe laughed a little too freely at the tavern last week. She must be in league with the devil, and when people started talking about sex with demons, they got real specific. These weren't vague suspicions. They drew it out in detail. Accusations of women laying with incubi, male demons who came to them in the night. Some swore they saw hoofprints near her door or heard her moaning at midnight. If that sounds like projection, yeah, it probably was. Historians still argue whether these sexual details came from the accused or the inquisitors. Either way, the women were caught in an impossible bind. Deny the charges and be tortured until you confess, or confess and be burned for your honesty. You glance over to where a woman is being interrogated. She's scared. Of course she is. But she's smart. She knows what they want to hear. So she tells them a story of a demon who came to her in the form of a handsome man, who kissed her, who touched her, who promised her secret knowledge. She says the name Lucifer, like it tastes like honey and ash. They write it down, they nod. The narrative is complete, and the town breathes a little easier, because now it all makes sense. The storm, the disease, the failed crops, it wasn't chance, it was her. You notice something, though. The townspeople look at her with horror, yes, but also with a strange kind of envy. Like maybe in the deepest part of themselves, they wish they could be as bold, as free, as willing to want. But that thought doesn't last long. The stake is already being prepared. Meanwhile, the church doubles down. Sermons grow more vivid. Confession becomes more invasive. Priests begin asking more questions about women's thoughts, dreams, fantasies. What did you feel when he touched you? Did you want it? Did you enjoy it? You shift in your seat. That doesn't sound like spiritual guidance. It sounds like surveillance. Inquisitors start keeping files. Pages upon pages of testimonies, many copied in the same exact phrases, almost like a script. And in a way, it is. Women are being coached into confessing their own damnation, and the public eats it up. You imagine someone selling bread by the execution square, children climbing walls to get a better view. It's grotesque, but somehow normal. And what were these women actually guilty of? Sometimes they had practiced herbal medicine. Sometimes they'd told fortunes. Sometimes they'd had dreams that made their husbands uncomfortable. Sometimes they'd simply been desired. And that, in a world built on male anxiety, was the worst kind of power. You look up and spot one woman's name scratched into the stone. Agnes. Not a monster, not a witch. Just someone who knew too much or wanted too much, or said the wrong thing at the wrong time. You whisper her name once, then again, Agnes. The wind seems to pause just for a second. Some women tried to run, some recanted, some went silent. But many, remarkably, spoke. They told their own stories, even knowing it might seal their fate. And in those stories, something unexpected glows beneath the horror. Truth. Maybe not truth in the factual sense, but emotional truth, a hunger, a loneliness, a longing, a claim to their own bodies, even at the cost of their lives. The world didn't just fear women's desire, it needed to make an example of it. You wrap your blanket a little tighter. The fire has gone out, but the smoke still lingers. You feel it in your throat, like a question you're not sure how to ask. Because the next time someone says, "She was burned for being a witch," you'll know better. She was burned because she wanted. You're lying very still now. But something stirs at the edge of your thoughts. It's nighttime, yes, but not the comforting kind. This is the kind of night where the air feels too thick, where shadows curl against your skin like cold breath. This is the hour when dreams don't feel like dreams. You're in the world of sleep demons and their favorite haunt, right between desire and dread. It's called sleep paralysis today, but back then, it had a name and a face. She was known as the night hag. You blink and she's there, perched on your chest, pressing the air out of your lungs. You want to scream but can't. You want to move, but your body won't listen. Your thoughts go sideways. Is this a demon? Is this punishment? In the Middle Ages, this terrifying experience wasn't understood as a neurological glitch or REM cycle hiccup. It was spiritual, and it was usually blamed on either demons or women who had made deals with them. And if you happened to be a man who woke up sweaty, breathless, maybe even a little aroused, you'd been attacked, clearly. Not just by guilt, but by a succubus, a female demon who came in the night and seduced men in their sleep. The details of these encounters? They were vivid, frightening, sometimes oddly detailed for something supposedly unwanted, which makes you wonder, who's really writing these narratives? And what are they trying to bury under all that parchment and shame? Historians still argue whether the phenomenon of the succubus came from genuine supernatural belief or was a convenient framework for explaining male arousal and nocturnal emissions. But either way, it wasn't just the men who paid the price. You turn toward the women, those whose names ended up in court records, their dreams held up as proof of guilt. A woman dreams of being kissed, and suddenly it's evidence. Another confesses to an erotic vision, and the priest writes it down with the ink of judgment. You picture a woman on her knees in the confessional. She's not even sure what she felt. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a memory. But she says the words anyway, because silence is suspicious. And the priest leans in, hungry, not for her, but for the script. The night hag, the succubus, the she-demon with wandering hands. All these figures tell the same tale in a different cloak. That women's bodies and desires aren't just feared, but othered, transformed into beings that haunt, punish, seduce, and destroy. And don't think this folklore was tucked away in dusty corners. These beliefs bled into every part of life. You'd find them in sermons, carved into bed frames, tucked into lullabies. Mothers warned their daughters not just about bad men, but about becoming something dark if they dared to want too much. You walk through a village now, late at night, where someone's drawn a protective circle with chalk outside their door, not against burglars, against witches, against dreams, against women. The logic loops again. If a woman has power in your dream, she must be evil. If she causes desire in your sleep, she must be possessed. If you can't control your thoughts, well, clearly she is to blame. Even women themselves started to fear their own dreams. You visit a convent, where a nun wakes from a dream she can't explain. She feels warm, flushed, guilty. She tells the Mother Superior, who tells her to fast, to pray, to lie on a stone floor for penance. The message is clear. Even the unconscious mind can be sinful. So she learns to fear her body even while asleep. You see this internalized. Women begin interpreting their own emotions as suspect. Did I smile too long at that stranger? Was that warm feeling in my chest a sign of sin? It's like a mirror that only reflects what's wrong, never what's human. And while this haunted the faithful, it also fed something darker, legal systems. In trials, especially witchcraft trials, dreams were often submitted as evidence. Testimonies included claims that women flew at night, or danced naked in moonlight, or lay with demons who wore the faces of their lovers. Sometimes the accused confessed these things, not because they were true, but because, under enough pressure, a nightmare starts to feel like memory. You sigh, because sleep was supposed to be the one place no one could follow you, but not in this world, not in this time. Even slumber gets surveilled. You trace your fingers along a woodcut illustration from a 15th century demonology book. It shows a man lying on his back, eyes wide with terror, while a horned woman crouches on his chest. It's dramatic, yes, but it's also strangely revealing. The man isn't tied up. He's not running, he's passive, frozen. And you wonder how many people use this image not to exercise their fears, but to excuse them. Because if a demon made you want, you're still the victim. If a woman made you dream, you're still pure. If something else caused the sin, then you stay clean. Convenient, right? Meanwhile, real women, tired women, good women, imperfect women, are paying the price. Accused of seduction for existing, blamed for being too present in someone else's sleep. You sit with this for a while, because now you understand. Desire wasn't just regulated in daylight, it was hunted in the dark. And the scariest part? Sometimes the monsters were real, but they weren't the ones in dreams. They were the ones who turned desire into evidence, who turned sleep into a trap. And in that dreamscape, one truth remains. The body remembers everything it was told to forget. Even in the deepest dark, even with the hag on your chest, even when you're too scared to open your eyes. You're awake again, but not quite. There's still a haze in the air, the kind that smells like wax and cold stone, like someone's been burning secrets in a thurible. You follow the scent, soft-footed, into a small, darkened chapel. It's empty, or almost. Behind the screen sits a man in black, still as a statue, waiting for a voice to pierce the silence. You've entered the confessional, a wooden box where thoughts go to be examined, stripped down, and, if deemed impure, cleaned by penance. But for women in the Middle Ages, this wasn't just about cleansing the soul, it was about control. You kneel beside a woman now. She's nervous. Her hands twist in her lap. She isn't sure how much to say, but the priest prompts her, gently at first, then more insistently. What did you feel? What exactly did you think? Did you want him to touch you? Did you resist? His tone is even, but the words slice. You realize something quickly. These aren't just questions, they're a script. The medieval church was obsessed with cataloging sin, especially when it came to sexuality, and it wanted every detail. Some confession manuals, the kind used to guide priests, got graphic. Not for titillation, at least that's what they said, but for precision, because, as the church saw it, only when a sin was named could it be forgiven. That meant women were asked to relive moments of desire in front of men who held power over their souls. You can feel the discomfort radiating off the walls, but the women didn't really have a choice. Refuse to confess, and you risk suspicion. Confess too fully, and you become marked. Every answer walked a tightrope over fire. Historians still argue whether confession was more about moral healing or institutional control. But you don't need a footnote to see what's going on here. The priest doesn't just want to know what she did. He wants to reshape what she thinks. He wants to take her desire, messy, human, complicated, and file it away into categories: temptation, lust, shame. You step back and watch this pattern unfold across centuries. A woman's desire wasn't just her own. It became evidence, something to be dissected and redirected. The church believed that by naming it, they could tame it. But naming something doesn't make it disappear. You walk now through a convent garden where nuns plant rosemary, lavender, and rue, herbs for memory, herbs for protection. You hear laughter, you hear prayers, and underneath it all, you feel longing. Yes, even here, because being cloistered didn't kill desire, it just changed its shape. Many women joined religious orders freely, seeking safety, purpose, even education. But even in these sacred spaces, desire found ways to breathe, through poetry, through visions, through whispered friendships under moonlight. Some nuns fell in love, with each other, with Christ, with ideas too big to name. They were taught to redirect all that passion toward God, and some did spectacularly. You meet Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun who had visions so intense, she claimed they came straight from the divine. She wrote music that soared like birds, letters that pierced like arrows. Her desire was wrapped in holy language, but it pulsed, vivid and alive. And then there was Hadowich, a Beguine mystic who wrote poems about divine union that read more like love letters than theology. One verse ends, "In that burning I dissolve." You pause. That's not just piety, that's poetry with a heartbeat. These women found ways to sublimate their longing, to take desire and aim it upward. The church approved, sort of, as long as they kept it mystical, metaphorical, not too physical, not too real. Because if female desire stayed spiritual, it could be celebrated. But if it crept too close to the body, if it crossed that invisible line into sweat and sighs, then we were back in sin territory. You wander through a scriptorium now, where young monks copy out these women's visions by candlelight. Some roll their eyes, others blush. A few pause too long on the page, because even when cloaked in Latin and liturgy, desire still speaks, still threatens, and so the church doubles down. Not just on confession, but on penance. You open a penitential guide, a sort of medieval sin catalog, and find a list of punishments for everything from fornication to lustful gazing. Some women were told to fast, others to wear heavy chains under their clothes. Some were denied communion, some were whipped, not because they acted, just because they felt. Even their thoughts became crimes. You feel a chill now, because what began as a moment of attraction has become an entire system, a machine designed to grind away the parts of a woman the world couldn't understand or handle. But women weren't passive in this. You visit a small village church where a woman sits alone in a pew. She's just finished confession. But as she leaves, she doesn't look broken. She looks sharper somehow. She's learned the rules, learned what to say, how to survive. Confession for many women became a kind of negotiation, a way to reclaim a little power in a world that offered so little. Say just enough. Keep your secrets folded beneath your tongue, because if the only place you're allowed to speak is the confessional, you learn to use that space well, and so you begin to understand. This wasn't just about purifying souls. It was about crafting a narrative, a world where female desire was always suspect, always conditional, always in need of correction. Even when that desire was innocent, even when it was divine. You trace your fingers across the worn wood of the confessional wall. Hundreds of hands have rested here. Hundreds of mouths have whispered into that tiny grate, hoping not just for forgiveness, but for understanding. Some got it, most didn't, but the echoes remain. The sun is high now, but the shadows have teeth. You step out of the chapel, blinking in the brightness, and the silence that follows feels less like peace, and more like a pause before the next blow. You're standing in a place where holiness is measured not by joy, but by what you don't feel, especially if you're a girl, especially if you're a virgin. Welcome to the virginity cult, where the highest spiritual status for a woman was to want nothing, touch no one, and bleed only in suffering. You walk slowly now, past rows of statues, thin girls carved in marble, their eyes lifted to heaven, their hands folded, their lips sealed, virgin martyrs, holy innocents. Some no older than children. They are praised for saying no, for resisting, for dying before touching, or being touched. Their stories were everywhere, passed down in glowing hagiographies. You might know some of their names. Saint Agnes, beheaded at 13. Saint Cecilia, suffocated then stabbed. Saint Lucy, eyes gouged out, yet still seeing divine light. You feel the tension rise. The price of holiness was often violence. In these tales, desire is always a threat. Not just other people's, but their own. The girls who become saints don't want, or if they do, they deny it completely. They pray their bodies away. Their yes to God must be matched by a hard, unwavering no to everything else. And so virginity becomes currency. For the church, a virgin was a spiritual powerhouse, untainted, unclaimed, pure. But virginity wasn't just about the body. It became political, even economic. Noble families guarded their daughters' purity like it was treasure, because in many cases, it was. A virgin could marry higher. A virgin could enter the convent with honor. A virgin could become a bride of Christ, not metaphorically, literally. Girls were veiled in white, given rings, and told they were married to Jesus himself. No pressure. Historians still argue whether these girls truly understood the roles they were accepting. Some likely did, many likely didn't, because the whole system relied on silence, obedience, and reverence for an ideal no one could question. You walk through a cloister now, cool and quiet, where girls as young as 12 were cloistered for life. Some thrived, finding joy in their routines, their prayers, their sisterhood. But others woke up each day with an ache they couldn't name, a hunger that wasn't evil, but had no place. Because here's the catch. In this world, purity wasn't just a condition, it was a performance. The way you walked, the way you dressed, the way you looked at someone. One wrong gesture, one misunderstood smile, and the illusion could crack. Then came the whispers, the suspicion, the questions. Was she really untouched? And so the purity panic spread. Through towns, through homes, through every carved pew and Sunday sermon. You pass by a bridal procession now, except the groom is nowhere to be seen. This is a consecrated virgin, being married to Christ. A bishop places a ring on her finger. A veil is drawn. She is now both bride and servant, queen of heaven and silent supplicant. It's beautiful and unsettling, because no one asks what happens if she wakes up 10 years from now, wondering what she missed, wondering what else she could have been. You sit beside a young girl now, maybe 13, maybe 14. She's being taught how to walk in silence, how to keep her eyes down, how to think holy thoughts when her body starts to shift and change in ways she doesn't understand. There's a phrase her tutor uses often, custodia virginitatis, the guarding of virginity. It makes it sound like a fortress, but really it's a prison, and sometimes the jailers were women too. Mothers, abbesses, older nuns who believed they were protecting the next generation. And maybe they were, from shame, from danger, from a world that punished desire more than it punished violence. But at what cost? Even married women couldn't escape this ideal. The perfect wife was expected to be pure in thought, meek in voice, and, ideally, not enjoying sex too much, unless it was for the sake of children. Pleasure without purpose? That was Eve talking again, and if you think this pressure stopped at the altar, think again. Medieval theologians debated whether Mary, mother of Jesus, remained a virgin her whole life, even after childbirth. Some said yes. Some said absolutely. Some even argued her hymen had miraculously resealed. Because the idea of Mary having a physical human body with normal anatomy was just too ordinary. The holy woman must be spotless, stainless in every sense. You glance at a fresco above. Mary is surrounded by light, yes, but also separated from the world by space, by language, by impossibility. She's not just pure, she's untouchable, and that becomes the ideal. You notice how few stories there are about women who wanted and lived. Not martyrs, not mothers, just women with desire who weren't punished, silenced, or sainted. The script didn't allow it. The binary held strong, virgin or whore, saint or sinner, bride of Christ or bride of chaos. You want to write someone new into the story, someone who laughs, who loves, who lives. But for now, you sit with the old ones. The girls praised for bleeding without ever touching, the women who were celebrated for never saying yes. And you wonder what would happen if one of them had stood up in the middle of Mass and said, "I want, I feel, I am." Would the sky have cracked? Would the saints have covered their ears? Or would the silence have finally broken? You're not sure how long you've been walking now, only that the ground has grown softer beneath your feet. Less stone, more earth, like something old is starting to breathe beneath the surface. You've passed through confessional walls, cloistered gardens, and execution squares, but now you find yourself in a strange and sacred middle ground, a place where ecstasy and agony blur. Welcome to the realm of holy hysteria, where desire is allowed, but only if it hurts. You sit beside a woman kneeling in candlelight, her arms outstretched, her eyes rolled back. She is not asleep, and she's not quite awake. Her voice quivers with language she doesn't know, her skin flushed, her breath quick. She says God has entered her, and maybe he has. But to you, watching from the edge, it also looks like longing finally got a name. This is the paradox of the mystic. Women were told their desire was dangerous, but if that same desire was directed upward, toward heaven, toward Christ, it could be celebrated, not just accepted, but exalted. And so began a long, strange tradition of women who wanted fiercely, deeply, urgently, and learned to call it God. You meet Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century Englishwoman who wept uncontrollably at the thought of Christ's suffering. She claimed to have visions of him holding her, kissing her, even lying in bed beside her. She called herself his bride. Some called her mad, others called her holy. The line was thin. Then there's Catherine of Siena, who refused marriage, fasted almost to death, and wrote passionate letters to the Pope and Christ alike. In one account, she receives a mystical wedding ring from Jesus himself, an invisible token, made not of gold, but of his foreskin. Yes, you heard that right. You raise an eyebrow, and rightly so, because this isn't just divine union, it's intensely bodily, physical, erotic even. But because it's with God, it's safe, sacred, allowed. Historians still argue whether these women were channeling suppressed erotic energy or truly experiencing divine ecstasy. Some say the visions were psychological. Others believe they were spiritual. But whatever they were, they gave women power. Brief, flickering, often painful, but real. You notice a strange trend. The closer these women came to spiritual authority, the more their bodies suffered. Stigmata, bleeding wounds matching Christ's crucifixion, became a symbol of closeness to God. Women like Saint Francis of Assisi and later Saint Catherine of Siena bore these marks. Blood on palms, feet, foreheads. But for women, the suffering often went further. They were praised for starving, for fainting, for crying so hard they lost their vision. Desire, it seems, could only be divine if it came with pain. You step into a monastery's infirmary and watch as a young mystic refuses food. She says she's full of divine love. Her body shrinks. Her eyes grow wide. She glows with something feverish. The priests hover near, unsure whether to exorcise or canonize. Because here's the secret everyone knew, but never said out loud. Mystic women made the church deeply uncomfortable. They bypassed male authority. They claimed direct access to God, and worse, people believed them. So the church walked a delicate line. Some mystics were embraced. Others were silenced. Some were investigated for heresy. A few were quietly shuffled off to remote convents. But still, the visions kept coming. You sit by a fire now, listening to a mystic describe her dream. Christ leans in, touches her lips, whispers her name. Her soul burns, her body aches. She wants him, not abstractly but wholly. And yet this longing must remain cloaked in metaphor. Because if she says it too plainly, they'll call her impure. If she leans too close to the edge of wanting, the rope of sainthood will snap. So she treads carefully. She writes her passion as poetry, her hunger as holiness. You begin to see the pattern. A woman could desire, so long as it looked like suffering, so long as it sounded like silence, so long as it was aimed upward, never outward. There's a medieval painting on the wall now, a saint swooning in Christ's arms, blood dripping from both their bodies, eyes locked. You stare. It's not just devotional, it's sensual, even romantic. And you can't help but think, is this a loophole? A sacred disguise for all the things women weren't allowed to say out loud? You think back to Marjorie Kempe, how she described weeping for hours, clinging to church statues, overcome with grief and joy and something else she never quite names. How people told her to calm down, how she didn't. Or Julian of Norwich, who saw Christ bleeding in her arms and said, "All shall be well." How she saw God not just as Lord, but sometimes, unforgettably, as Mother. You realize now, these women weren't just mystics, they were translators. They took forbidden feelings and turned them into scripture. They gave language to what had only been silence. But it came at a cost. They were often sick, often lonely. Their lives were short, intense, and filled with visions that sometimes felt more like burdens than gifts. And still, they chose it, or maybe it chose them. Because in a world where female desire was always suspect, this was one of the only ways to keep it alive. You glance back at the mystic still kneeling in the corner. She's quiet now. Her hands shake. She says she's seen the face of God. But maybe, just maybe, she's also seen her own face reflected back, and for the first time, believed it was holy. The wind shifts now, and the air carries the scent of beeswax and damp wool. You're in a different space, not a monastery or dungeon or field of fire, but something far more delicate. You stand before walls painted not with blood or doctrine, but with shimmering tapestries and luminous gold leaf. Welcome to the world of medieval art, where desire doesn't scream, it smirks. You enter a great hall hung with woven scenes, kings on thrones, angels in flight, knights kneeling before ladies whose expressions are just a little too amused. You pause at one in particular. A woman holds a mirror in one hand and a serpent in the other. Her dress spills like silk down to her feet. Her hair is loose, her smile dangerous. She is Eve, yes, but also every woman the viewer was taught to fear, or want, or both. Medieval art was never neutral. It didn't just reflect belief, it shaped it. And when it came to women, especially women with any trace of desire, artists reached deep into the collective anxiety and painted temptation into everything. You walk past images of women, always beautiful, always just on the edge of trouble. One rides a lion, labeled pride. Another lounges in a garden while tiny devils tug at her gown. You start to see the pattern. In this world, a woman's body is never just a body. It's a symbol. She is sin. She is salvation. She is something to be controlled or worshipped from afar. But here's the odd part. Even in paintings warning against female desire, the desire is still there, draped in gold, posed in ways that are unmistakably sensual. A thin veil, a sly glance, a foot just slightly out of place. These details are intentional. You wonder how many monks wrote long sermons condemning lust, while secretly staring a little too long at the altarpiece. Historians still argue whether artists were consciously eroticizing women, or simply reflecting cultural fears. But whatever their intent, the effect was clear. Women in medieval art were often depicted as seductresses, even when painted in halos. Take Mary Magdalene, for instance. Her legend is tangled, part sinner, part saint. In many medieval images, she's shown with loose hair, a major symbol of sexual freedom, gazing upward, eyes full of tearful devotion. Her body is usually draped in fabric just loose enough to hint. She repents, yes, but with such passion that it almost feels like desire wearing new clothes. You move past the gallery and into a scriptorium, where illuminations curl in the margins of manuscripts. Here, too, women appear, sometimes naked, sometimes wrapped in snakes, sometimes riding beasts. A nun draws one with a wink, maybe out of mischief, maybe out of something deeper. Desire, even when punished, leaks through the cracks. You pause before a painting of Delilah cutting Samson's hair. She's labeled a traitor, but her face is serene, her fingers gentle. You can't help but wonder, is she evil? Or is she just tired of being the background in someone else's epic? Medieval plays echoed these same themes. In morality plays and mystery pageants, women's roles were rarely complex. You were either virtue or vice, chastity or lust, Mary or Eve. The costuming helped the audience. White robes for the good girls, red dresses and wild hair for the bad. And yet, despite the moralizing, the audience always watched the red dresses more closely. You think about what that says. Not just about the people on stage, but the people watching. Desire didn't vanish. It just got recast. Made safe through distance. Wrapped in metaphor. Painted into allegory so no one had to admit what they were really looking at. Even architecture joined the performance. You walk under the archway of a great cathedral, where stone figures flank the doors. Many are saints, some are not. You notice a woman carved beside a demon, her body twisting, her breasts exposed, her face twisted into something both ecstatic and terrified. She's not a person, she's a lesson. These carvings, known as Sheila Na gigs, appear on churches across Europe. Naked women, often with exaggerated features, meant to ward off evil, or perhaps remind viewers of it. Scholars can't agree. Were they fertility icons? Warnings against lust? Pagan goddesses smuggled into sacred spaces? You lean closer, the stone is weathered, but the message lingers. You were meant to see her, and to flinch. Even virgin saints weren't spared the artistic double standard. Saint Agatha, whose breasts were cut off during martyrdom, is often depicted holding them on a silver platter. A horrifying image, but one that keeps the focus on her body. Her suffering becomes spectacle. Her holiness gets braided with the very thing she tried to renounce. You pause at a stained glass window, lit in blues and reds. It shows a woman, draped, demure, but her expression is complex, almost knowing. You imagine the glazier pausing as he added the final lines to her mouth, the glint to her eye. Maybe he didn't mean to make her beautiful, or maybe he did. Maybe he couldn't help it, because that's the truth no one said out loud. Even when condemned, female desire fascinated. Even when denounced, it drew attention. And artists, many of them monks, scribes, devout believers, couldn't resist weaving that fascination into the very art used to warn against it. You step back from the wall and realize something. The visual culture of the Middle Ages didn't just reflect fear of female desire. It reveled in it, wrapped it in gold, posed it in chapels, gave it names like Judith, Salome, Jezebel, and then painted them with such richness that the warnings almost felt like invitations. You leave the gallery behind, the images still flickering in your mind like candlelight. Because you know now, every time someone said, "Don't look," they also left the door slightly open. The gallery fades behind you now, and the golden light is gone. You descend into colder air, rougher stone, and voices no longer singing or whispering, but shouting. Here, the sound of boots echoes down narrow corridors. Metal clinks, chains scrape. You've stepped into the world of inquisition and torture, where the fear of female desire is no longer philosophical or poetic. It's procedural, it's brutal, and it's written in ledgers. This is the machinery of power. You walk past rows of records, parchment stacked high, each page a confession, a name, a list of tools. Desire isn't just demonized here, it's criminalized. If you think of the Middle Ages as a slow, dreamy landscape of incense and stained glass, this is the part that snaps like bone. This is the part where fear turns sharp, and punishment becomes a performance. You follow a narrow hallway into a room with a high-backed chair. Iron clamps, hooks, a brazier in the corner. No, it's not a dungeon out of some fantasy novel. It's an official courtroom of the Inquisition. And if you were a woman accused of lust, temptation, or unholy visions, this is where you'd be brought. Not to pray, but to prove your innocence, usually by surviving pain. The inquisitors weren't merely priests. They were trained interrogators, operating under the belief that sin must be rooted out like rot. And they had specific questions for women, always the same ones. Did you consort with devils? Did you seduce men with magic? Did you enjoy the acts? Enjoy. That word came up more than you'd expect. You sit with a woman now. Her name might be Isabella or Marie or Agneta. She doesn't know how she got here. A neighbor's complaint. A confession heard wrong. A husband who didn't like her laughter. Now she's accused of sexual heresy, a term so vague it covers anything from sleeping with demons to knowing the wrong herbs. She says she's innocent. They ask again, and then the tools come out. The breast ripper, designed to punish women for carnal sins. The scold's bridle, a metal gag used to silence women deemed too outspoken, especially if they discussed men, dreams, or pleasure. The iron chair, heated from below, used to make the body confess what the mind wouldn't. This isn't history as metaphor anymore. This is a system, meticulously organized, meant to punish bodies that refuse to stay quiet. And at the heart of so many cases, desire? Maybe she said she felt a warmth at Mass. Maybe she was caught touching herself. Maybe she admitted to dreams about a man, or a spirit, or something she couldn't explain. The Church called these proofs of demonic influence, and the Inquisition called them confessions in waiting. Historians still argue how much these trials were driven by theology versus control. Some say they were about rooting out heresy. Others say they were about silencing women, probably both. But either way, the process remained the same. Suspicion, interrogation, pain, and sometimes fire. You pass another record. A girl, 16, accused of lying with a spirit. Her dreams were too vivid, her words too confident. She was burned within the week. Her ashes were scattered, her name recorded, her story reduced to a sentence. But you know it was longer than that, and not every woman broke. Some resisted, some gave vague answers, some clung to the stories that kept them sane. One woman, accused of harboring a succubus in her home, responded, "Then he must also do the dishes, because no man of flesh has ever helped me." It wasn't a joke, but it almost was. That moment of wit, of living, survived in the records. You learn to read the margins now, not just the lines written by men in robes, but the spaces between, the silences, the subtle defiance. Even in trial transcripts, you can hear women's voices pushing back. They describe dreams without shame. They say their feelings weren't evil. They claim they were touched by angels, not devils. They refuse to call their longing a sin. And that refusal, that was the real danger. Because a woman who says, "I felt pleasure, and it made me whole," doesn't fit the script. She threatens the system, and so they double down. Women were examined physically, often invasively, to find witches' marks or devil's teats, spots supposedly used to suckle familiar spirits. Often, these were just birthmarks, scars, moles. But if they didn't flinch when pricked with a needle, guilty, you shudder. Because you've seen this before, just not in robes and Latin. A system that turns bodies into evidence. That assumes guilt when a woman says, "I wanted." You leave the courtroom behind, but the echoes follow. You pass a pyre site, long grown over with moss. It looks peaceful now. Birds nest in the rocks. Children might play nearby, never knowing what burned there. But the land remembers. You sit in the grass, listening. And in the quiet, you hear the questions again. Not from inquisitors, but from the women who didn't get to finish their sentences. Why can't I dream? Why can't I touch? Why can't I want? The answers never mattered. Because in the end, the system wasn't built to hear them. It was built to break them. And still, some voices slipped through. Scrawled into margins, hidden in herb books. Carved into the underside of pews. Not loud, not triumphant, but there. And they whisper to you now. They thought desire was fire. They were right. The ash settles. The iron doors are closed. You leave the scorched ground behind and follow a winding path into a gentler place, at least on the surface. It smells like beeswax and bread, like bedtime stories whispered beside the hearth. But don't get too comfortable. This is still a world of warnings. You've stepped into the realm of moral tales and martyr legends, where every story is sugar-dusted and sharp as glass. You sit at the edge of a wooden bench, and a monk begins to read. His voice is slow, deliberate. He's reading to children tonight, well, to young girls mostly. And the story he's chosen is one they've heard before, just never out loud. It starts sweetly enough. A girl, a choice, a test. Then comes the twist. She says no, to the wrong man, or the wrong prince, or the wrong temptation. And so, naturally, she dies. You blink. Wait, that's it? Yes, that's it. Because in these tales, the right decision is often fatal. The girl keeps her virtue and loses her life. You listen to the tale of St. Agnes again. She's 12 or 13, and a powerful man wants her. She says no, she belongs to Christ. So they strip her, drag her through the streets, try to break her spirit. She doesn't break. Instead, she dies a virgin martyr, and her story becomes bedtime material. You look around. The girls in the room are quiet, wide-eyed. No one questions the logic, better dead than defiled. It's a theme that repeats again and again. St. Barbara, locked in a tower by her father to preserve her purity. He finds out she's converted to Christianity. He kills her himself. St. Dymphna, who flees her father's incestuous advances. He finds her, beheads her, and is never punished. Dymphna becomes the patron saint of mental illness. St. Maria Goretti, a more modern saint canonized in the 20th century. Attacked by a man who tries to rape her, she refuses and is murdered. Her forgiveness makes her holy. Not her survival, not her fury, her forgiveness. You begin to see it clearly now. These weren't stories to entertain. They were instructions. Be good, be silent, say no, die well. And girls absorbed these lessons young. Through stories, through songs, even through toys. Wooden dolls dressed as nuns. Miniature books of saints with blank, sweet faces. Desire wasn't just discouraged. It was scrubbed out, replaced with obedience and holy suffering. The heroines of these tales weren't allowed to want. They were only allowed to refuse. You wander into a village church where the stained glass windows tell the same stories. Bright colors, glorious halos, each pane a woman in pain, dying, praying, bleeding, but always looking upward, never inward, never across at the world they were leaving behind. And you wonder, where were the stories of women who survived, who said yes to something and lived? You leaf through a medieval morality book and find tale after tale with the same arc. A woman desires, she acts, she is punished, she repents or dies. If she repents, she becomes holy. If she doesn't, she becomes a cautionary tale. Even fiction couldn't escape this structure. You read about knights and their ladies, courtly love they called it. But the lady never gets to speak. She's an object of longing, perfect, distant, silent. Her purity makes her desirable, and her desirability makes her dangerous. So the knight suffers, he prays. He wins her favor only when he proves he'll suffer more. And the lady? She stays two-dimensional. You listen to a jongleur, an old-school storyteller, recount the tale of a young girl who tempted a monk. He resisted. She turned into a demon. He was rewarded. She was never seen again. Lesson learned. The message behind all these stories is simple. Female desire, when expressed, leads to ruin, and male desire, when resisted, leads to sainthood. It's exhausting. You meet a girl, let's call her Elena, who grew up on these stories. She dreams of love, but feels guilty for it. She fasts, she prays. She scolds her reflection for wanting to look nice, because she knows the script. If she feels too much, she'll fall. And if she falls, she'll either have to repent or disappear. But sometimes stories go rogue. You find a few that don't follow the formula. A local folktale about a clever girl who tricks a lusty priest. A bawdy song sung by washerwomen about a nun who runs away to marry a miller. A marginal note in a Bible where someone wrote, "Mary loved deeply." Just that, nothing more, but it feels like rebellion. Historians still argue how much of this folklore was real, How much was satire, and how much was wishful thinking? But it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they existed, slivers of stories that made room for women who wanted without dying for it. You leave the church now, the glass glowing behind you, and walk into the cool night. And you start to think about stories, the ones we're told, the ones we repeat, the ones that shape us without our permission. How bedtime tales weren't meant to soothe, but to warn. How martyrdom was sold as victory and survival was suspicious. But you also think about the listeners, the girls who nodded and smiled and obeyed, while secretly imagining a different ending. One where the girl wants, one where the girl runs, one where the girl lives. The stories echo behind you, the hymns fade to a hum, and the saints slip quietly back into their windows. You walk now into a space that feels oddly modern. Still medieval, yes, but there's music in the air, laughter in the distance, and something warmer in the light. It's not the monastery, and it's not the market. You've entered the strange, glittering territory of courtly love, a place where desire doesn't get you burned. It gets you serenaded. You're at a noble court now, somewhere in southern France or northern Italy. The air smells of lavender and warm bread. Minstrels strum lutes under ivy-covered balconies. Poets lean against columns, reciting verses about unrequited love. And everywhere you turn, someone is sighing, "Welcome to the courts of love, where passion is finally allowed, so long as it plays by very specific, very inconvenient rules." Here, you don't confess your feelings in dark corners. You compose them in rhymed couplets. You don't grab a kiss, you request one, in metaphor, probably while kneeling. Love is a game, and like any game, it has rules. Rule 1, your lady must be unattainable, married preferably. Rule 2, your love must be pure, no touching, no consummation, just yearning, endless, poetic yearning. Rule 3, suffering is romantic. The more you ache, the more noble your desire. You hear these rules recited like gospel in the lyrics of troubadours, those wandering poets of the 12th and 13th centuries. Their songs describe women as bright stars, distant flames, holy altars of beauty. Women are to be worshipped, adored, placed on pedestals so high that no man could ever reach them. And you realize this is another kind of prison. It looks better than the fire. It smells better than the cloister. But still, it's a space where female desire doesn't get to speak. It gets written about, sung about, projected onto. Historians still argue whether courtly love was real or a literary fantasy passed around like perfume on parchment. Some say it was genuine social interaction. Others call it an emotional sandbox where men could act out longing without consequence. Whatever it was, it certainly wasn't equal, because here's the twist. Women were central to this world, but rarely in control of it. You listen to a troubadour singing beneath a lady's window. She smiles, maybe, but she doesn't write back. If she does, her words are filtered through male scribes, or buried in layers of etiquette. Even when women entered the game, like the troubadours, female troubadours who wrote their own verses, they were exceptions. Their voices ring clear, bold, sometimes challenging. One wrote, "I must sing of what I don't have." You wonder if she meant love or freedom. You lean in as she continues, "I love him and he does not love me." It's direct, raw, and just slightly dangerous. A woman saying what she feels, in public, in rhyme. But those voices are rare. Mostly, women in courtly tales are objects, not agents. They're adored, but not consulted. Loved, but not listened to. And their desire, it's invisible. Because in this system, only the man gets to suffer. You read through romance after romance. Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, lovers who ache and pine and often die, but rarely live happily and never on equal terms. The woman's role is to inspire, not to want. Still, something about this world feels different. It's not the church now, it's the poets who are moralizing. And while their version of love is no freer, it looks like liberation, which in a way makes it even trickier. You sit in on a court of love, a real thing, sometimes staged by noble women as entertainment. They debate cases of romance like legal trials. Was this knight truly devoted? Did this lady flirt too boldly? Was the gift of a glove enough to signal affection? The debates were clever, the questions almost satirical, but they echoed real anxieties. Who gets to desire? Who gets to refuse? Who writes the ending? In the center of this game sits a paradox. Women are worshipped as long as they remain out of reach. The second a woman desires openly, she stops being a muse and starts being a problem. You picture a noblewoman, let's call her Elaine, sitting in her chamber, listening to songs written about her by men she barely knows. She's supposed to be flattered. She's supposed to blush. But maybe, just maybe, she wants to write her own song. Not about being adored, but about wanting back. That story doesn't get written, or if it does, it's hidden in a footnote, a diary, a whisper between tapestries. You start to see courtly love not as freedom, but as a mirror, one that reflects male longing back to itself and calls it noble. Meanwhile, female desire stays blurred, implied, or left out entirely. And when the women of these tales do act on their feelings, like Guinevere or Isolde, the result is always the same: disaster. Because the game is only beautiful as long as it's not real. You notice now that behind all the elegance, the roses, the riddles, the embroidered veils, lurks the same old rule. Wanting for women is dangerous. Whether it leads to flames, cloisters, or poetry, it's always a risk. Even when dressed in silk, you rise from the court, stepping past half-finished sonnets and pressed flowers. The music fades, and for a moment, you wonder what would happen if one of the women in these stories simply said, "I'm not your muse, I'm not your metaphor, I want what I want." Would the court laugh? Would the poet stutter? Would someone write her a verse? Or would they simply pretend she never spoke at all? And now you're walking slower. The road isn't cobbled anymore. It's soft, a little muddy, the way earth feels just after rain. The colors shift too, from gilded tapestries and blood-red martyrdom to soft browns, pale pinks, and powdered whites. You've made it to the late Middle Ages. The church still rules, the poets still sing, but something's changing. You've arrived at the strange, stifled hush of the Renaissance. The moment when the obsession with female desire doesn't vanish. It simply goes quiet. You step into a drawing room in Florence. It's beautiful in here. Paintings on the walls, a fire in the hearth, fine fabrics draped over finely trained postures. But no one's talking about sin or lust or saints anymore. They're talking about manners. And just like that, you feel the silence descend. You're in a world that doesn't burn women for their desire. It erases it. During the Renaissance, humanism blooms. Art thrives. Books proliferate. Science stretches its limbs. And yet, for all the progress, female agency shrinks. Desire is no longer demonized as loudly. Instead, it's gently suffocated under layers of etiquette, modesty, and impossible virtue. You watch a girl being taught how to curtsy, how to speak softly, how to lower her eyes, not too low, just enough to show humility. She's given books, not of philosophy, but of conduct. One of them, The Courtier by Castiglione, outlines how a woman should behave. She must be graceful, witty, silent, chaste, pleasing, always pleasing. Desire is no longer punished with fire. It's punished with refinement. Historians still debate whether the Renaissance was a time of progress for women or just a prettier kind of prison. Women were painted more often, but as symbols, not subjects. They were educated more often, but in ways that made them more decorative, not more free. You flip through a courtesy manual. It explains how women must speak just enough to entertain, but not enough to challenge. How they must dress attractively, but modestly. How they must write poems, perhaps, but only about God. Never about wanting, never about longing. Desire becomes impolite. You walk into a banquet hall filled with laughter and music, and notice how no one says the words anymore. Lust, longing, temptation. Those belong to the past. Now it's about modesty, propriety, grace. But the pressure hasn't lifted. It's just evolved. Women are still measured, still watched, still taught that wanting too much of anything makes them less elegant, less virtuous, less marriageable, and now, marriage becomes the central axis. In previous centuries, the Church tried to eliminate desire through vows of chastity. In the Renaissance, society tries to control it through matrimony. You see a woman at her writing desk. She pens a letter to a suitor. She says all the right things, soft admiration, carefully wrapped emotion. But in the corners of her handwriting, you see what she doesn't say, what she wants to say, what the rules won't allow. Even the art reflects this change. You stare at a portrait, perhaps by Botticelli or Bronzino, of a woman in silk, her body impossibly still. Her skin glows, her eyes shine, but her mouth is closed, always closed. She is beauty without voice, ornament without impulse. You look closer and see her ringed hand resting just over her belly. A suggestion, a whisper of fertility. She exists to be admired, not to act. Desire now lives in gesture, in glance, in suggestion, and always with an exit. You listen in on a conversation at a salon, a group of men debating female nature. Are women naturally more passionate, one asks? No, another replies. They are cold creatures, passionless, rational only when silenced. You sit beside a woman who says nothing, and yet her gaze speaks volumes. There are exceptions, of course, there always are. Veronica Franco, a Venetian courtesan, writes with heat and wit, refusing to be polite about her intelligence or her passion. She pens bold, biting poems and letters that flirt and sting. But she's an outlier, a scandal, a curiosity. Most women of the Renaissance, even those who could read and write, were offered a new script. Softer, subtler, more suffocating. The goal wasn't to burn the body anymore. It was to domesticate it. Desire was to be packaged into marriage, motherhood, quiet prayer. Anything beyond that was dangerous, not diabolical, just impolite, unbecoming. You wander through a library, pages fluttering. Even the books change. In medieval times, women were sainted or scorched. In Renaissance literature, they're reimagined as obedient daughters, tragic lovers, noble wives. Juliet dies, Desdemona dies, Ophelia drowns, and no one calls it martyrdom anymore, just poetry. You step out into a garden where two young women read aloud from a book of Petrarchan sonnets. The poems describe love as longing, pain, divine torment, but only from the male perspective. The women reading them smile, they sigh, and they stay silent. You look around and notice that female desire didn't vanish in the Renaissance. It just became ghosted, not gone, just unreadable, pushed into the margins, turned into allegory, explained away as nerves, as dreams, as the product of too much imagination. Even medical books, once obsessed with wandering wombs and hysterical fluids, start describing women in quieter terms. Still irrational, but now passively so. No longer witches, just wives who cry too much. The heat is gone, the flame reduced to a flicker behind tightly drawn curtains, and yet, in a hidden drawer beneath a dressing table, someone has stashed a note, a poem, a confession. It's unsigned, unread, nearly invisible, but it begins, "I want," that's all it says, and it's everything. Because in a world where female desire has been shamed, hunted, sanctified, painted, disguised, and finally silenced, to want is the oldest, quietest form of rebellion. And you realize the hush isn't peace, it's pressure. It's history pressing down, smoothing every rough edge, folding up every fierce story into something softer, easier, less dangerous. But the stories are still there. You carry them now. The saints who wept, the witches who fought, the mystics who burned, the girls who said no, the women who said yes, the lovers who wrote one line and dared to hide it. Their voices live under layers of lace and law and lace again, whispering. You can want, you always could. As the night slows and your breath evens out, the echoes of their stories begin to fade. Not erased, just quieter, like footsteps softening down a long corridor. The stone gives way to moss, the chant to silence, and the fire no longer burns. It just glows. You're back where you started, but something's shifted. You've seen how a single story about a bite of fruit grew into centuries of fear, of laws, of silence. How wanting, if you were a woman, meant walking a path laced with judgment, dressed as obedience. But you've also seen something else, persistence. In the hymns and in the margins, in the resistance and the revision, in the dreams and in the poems that start with I want, desire survives, not cleanly, not loudly, but unmistakably. So now you lay your head back, letting the last threads of the tale settle like dust in candlelight. The air is still, the story has exhaled, and the night is yours again. Close your eyes. Let history rest beside you, not as a weight, but as a whisper. You're safe now. And the story? The story is still humming,